After passing through the narrow gate, which guards the entrance to the upper part of the mountain, after moving forward without looking back, the pilgrim finally enters into purgatory proper, the 7 ascending terraces, each of which is devoted to helping the souls correct their vicious tendencies by forcing them, through spiritual exercises, to develop opposing spiritual powers. In the Canti I plan to focus on today, Purgatorio 10 to 17, the pilgrim will ascend and pass through the first 3 rings of the mountain. That is, he'll begin on the terrace of the prideful, climb up a stairwell to get to the second terrace, the terrace of the envious, and then also pass through the terrace of the wrathful. As Dante will explain in Canto 17, purgatory, just like hell, has its own intricate system of order. You'll remember that in Inferno 11, the poet had Dante and Virgil come to a halt while they waited for their senses to get adjusted to the stench of hell. There the Roman poet described hell as divided into 2 major realms, upper hell and lower hell, where lower hell is the realm of the malicious, those who are unjust to their neighbors through either violence or deception, as opposed to those in upper hell who simply acted with incontinence. This, as Virgil explicitly says, is a very classical way of thinking about good and evil, and Dante says that he takes it straight from Aristotle. In Purgatorio, though, Dante takes advantage of a similar delay in the progress of the pilgrim, this time in Canto 17, to explain that, in a way, purgatory is an inverted hell. The more serious offenses are purged on the first terraces, while the less serious offenses are purged toward the top of the mountain. But at the same time, the ordering principle is new. It's that of the Christian tradition of the 7 deadly sins: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust. But these 7 deadly sins are in turn ordered into groups of 3, so that they correspond in a way to upper hell and the 2 subsections of lower hell. And what's more, these 7 deadly sins, which come from the ancient tradition of the monastic desert fathers, are further woven together with the Beatitudes mentioned by Christ in the Gospels. In this way, Dante's imagination is fully classical and fully biblical, and he weaves all of these strands together in his Purgatorio. Although there are important similarities and significant overlaps, Purgatory, of course, is a place which feels very different. To really get at these differences, I'd like to look more closely at Canto 17, where Dante gives us his moral geography lecture on the topographical arrangement of purgatory. At that analogous moment in Inferno 11, where Virgil explained the geography of hell, the travelers were radically isolated, waiting to get used to the vile and noxious smell of hell. But here in Canto 17, we find the pilgrim lost deep within another vision. He's almost completely deaf and blind to the world, stumbling along when the angel who guards the terrace of the wrathful interrupts his vision and invites the 2 to continue to climb. Virgil comments, "This divine spirit is directing us toward the ascent without our even asking, concealed in his own shining. He cares for us as we do for ourselves, since one who sees and another's need and awaits the asking maliciously has set his mind upon refusal. We should accept so kind an invitation with our feet." Verses 55 to 61. In other words, the angel breaks their solitary wandering and extends aid to them before they've asked for it. Once they've passed into the next terrace, and the sun drops below the horizon, thus leaving them without their strength for climbing, Virgil begins to explain the order of purgatory. In this way, the dramatic scenery surrounding the description of purgatory is very different. As Virgil explains, every free thing in the world is fundamentally motivated by love. Or as he says, "Love must be the seed in you of every virtue, and of every deed that merits punishment." Thus, even sin should be thought of not so much as a wicked choice, but rather as misdirected love. Virgil says that we can misdirect our inherent love by loving with too little force, that which we should love, we can love too much the lower goods and thus disrupt the hierarchy, trying to put lower goods to a use they were not intended for. Or our self-love can grow to the point that it's out of control so that it becomes fear. Fear that our neighbor will deprive us of the good we long for. For Virgil, this vicious tendency to love the injury of our neighbors has its deep roots in pride, envy, and wrath. In other words, what I'm trying to emphasize is that if you take Inferno 11 and Purgatorio 17 as companion pieces, then you see that Virgil's providing, in some sense, the deep answer for why that malice we saw in hell exists in the first place. That is, because these sinners have failed in love. Here's how Virgil puts it. One hoping to excel by bringing down his neighbor longs that from his greatness his neighbor be brought low. There is the one who fears the loss of power, favor, honor, fame, should he be bettered by another. This so aggrieves him that he wants to see him fall. And there is one who thinks himself offended and hungers after vengeance, and he must then contrive another's harm. It's important to point out that this speech on how love is at the center of the cosmos, that love is in an interesting way even related to unsuccessful human behavior, comes within what happens to be the 51st canto. That is, the first canto in the second half of the comedy. Thus, you could say that for Dante, Purgatorio 16 is the last canto of the first half, while Purgatorio 17 is the first canto of the second half. Thus, these canti literally lie at the heart of the comedy as a whole. These canti then taken together form a kind of diptych, like those panel paintings which stood on altars of the churches in Dante's day. Let's look then at what stands on the other side, balancing out Virgil's speech on love. It comes in Canto 16, the last canto of the first half of the Commedia, and it's found in Marco Lombardo's speech on freedom. On the ledge where the wrathful are purified, the souls are forced to walk in a thick smoke, like that thick, fatty smoke which comes off cooked meat on the grill. And they hold their eyes tightly shut while chanting the Agnus Dei. There Dante meets an old courtier who would have existed in what Dante would have thought of as the good old days, about a century before Dante wrote. He's portrayed as the perfect knight, chivalrous, commanding, brave, or as Marco puts it, as one who, quote, knew the world and loved that valor at which today all aim a slackened bow. The pilgrim takes the opportunity to ask Marco his favorite question, why the world is barren now of every virtue and heavy with and overgrown by evil. To which Marco heaves a heavy sigh and groans, saying, you who are still alive assign each cause only to the heavens as though they drew all things along upon their necessary paths. If that were so, free choice would be denied you, and there would be no justice when one feels joy for doing good or misery for evil. Yes, the heavens give motion to your inclinations. I don't say all of them, but even if I did, you still possess a light to winnow good from evil, and you have free will. In other words, Marco Lombardo attacks those who would blame the evil of the world on environmental factors. We might say neuroscience or psychology, while the world of Dante would have said the influence of the heavenly bodies on our dispositions and temperaments. In other words, astrology. But Marco, while admitting that environmental circumstances, of course, do shape our dispositions, insist that they cannot account for everything. Otherwise, human beings would be left guiltless for their mistakes and undeserving of reward for their virtuous choices. Marco then goes on to liken the soul to a capricious little girl, one I like to imagine about the age of 6. He says, from the hand of him who looks on it with love, before it lives, comes forth, like a little girl who weeps one moment and as quickly laughs, the simple infant soul that has no knowledge, but moved by a joyous maker, gladly turns to what delights it. At first it tastes the savor of a trifling good. It is beguiled by that and follows in pursuit. if guide or rein do not deflect its love. In other words, Dante's vision of the soul in sin is delightfully free of any sober and oppressive puritanical vision of its latent evil. Rather, the soul is pulled toward goods like a little girl who's delighted by wildflowers along the way and skips after them. But the appetite, if not managed by reason, will keep skipping along after this and that and lose itself away from the path. Sin, then, is becoming fixated with minor goods, exalting them and looking in them for something that they are too shallow to fully possess. Dante wrote about this deception of the soul also in an earlier treatise called his Convivio, where he said, "Because the soul's knowledge is at first imperfect, little goods appear great to it. And so we see little children intensely longing for an apple, and then going further, longing for a little bird, and then further on, longing for fine clothes, and then a horse, and then a mistress, and then wealth, and then much wealth, and then enormous wealth. And this comes to pass because in no one of these things does he find that for which he is ever searching, but believes he will find it one step further on." Dante also likens the human experience to one traveling along a dark road. And with each light on the horizon, he hopes he's found an inn, and thus sets all of his desire on it, but is frustrated when he draws near to recognize it was never any inn at all. Marco concludes his speech by saying that if the law and just rulers do not aid their communities by holding the reins, steering individuals in the way they should go, then simple souls will simply chase after their own desires and stray from the path. The world devolves into the chaotic and broken democracy of pleasure it has become. In these Canti, then, we have a number of breathtaking speeches. Virgil's speech on mirrors in 15, which we don't have time to discuss. Marco Lombardo's speech on freedom and the soul as a little girl in 16. And finally, Virgil's speech on love in 17. These latter two speeches stand at the center of Dante's book, and thus at the heart of Dante's vision of the world of humanity. At the heart of Dante's great poem, as we have said, we have one side of the diptych, a picture of man's freedom, and on the other facing panel, we have a picture of love, but a love which erupts, rushes into, invades, and courses through the world. At the center of the cosmos, then, is love moving out to ask for the generous response of humanity, waiting for human beings to use their freedom to respond to that love. And this is Dante's vision of the drama of human existence. It's also the reason why Dante thinks that sin is so vicious, because sin entails closing yourself off from this world of love. This, then, is the center point of Dante's cosmos, love and freedom. And the two Canti give us a beautiful encapsulation of Dante's humanism. That is, his delight in the power and virtues of man, his conviction that man is capable of tremendous things if he exercises his will accordingly. But at this point, with this grandiose vision in mind, I want to take the rest of this lecture to focus more particularly on the three sins purged in the terraces the pilgrim traverses between Canto 10 and 17. It's certainly true that Dante gives us glimpses of the good which awaits us, but in the meantime, he also shows us that we keep falling asleep to it because of particular sins. When we get to Canto 10, we haven't yet seen any souls in active purgation. We've only met souls waiting for the opportunity. But when the pilgrim finally gets his first glimpse of the souls involved in active purgation, he's horrified and worried that even just reporting their suffering will actively discourage the future readers of his poem. In a passage I've quoted before, the poet addresses us. "Reader, I would not have you fall away from good intentions when you hear the way God wills the debt to be paid. Do not dwell upon the nature of the suffering. Think what is to follow. Think that at the worst it cannot last beyond the final judgment." That's in Canto 10, verses 106 to 114. He sees, of course, the proud walking around and around the terrace, but carrying such enormous rocks on their backs that they're weighed down to the point that their faces are just millimeters away above the earth. In this way, the backs of the proud are broken. With each trembling step, they think that their legs are just about to collapse under their burden. And as they step, they cry out, più non posso, più non posso. Literally, more I cannot. Their words then, on the most basic level, are a painful cry that they're nearly broken. But even in the midst of their pain, there emerges a kind of deeper recognition. I myself am not able to do any more, but nevertheless, somehow, some way, I continue. As if the realization becomes not so much a cry of despair, I can't handle any more of this, but becomes an acknowledgement that it's not I who can mount the strength to continue. The rocks, then, are a tremendous spiritual exercise for the proud. In Canto 12, we learn something else about these prideful but penitential souls. And that is that as they painfully inch along, and as the towering rocks on their shoulders force their faces to hover just above the path they trod, they're made to look at the images carved into their way. And there they see a dozen famous images of pride. They see Nimrod, the name medieval scholars gave to the king responsible for building the Tower of Babel. They see Niobe, the mythological figure who boasted she had more children than the goddess Leto. They study pictures of Saul and Sennacherib from the Bible, and they watch the destruction of the proud city of Troy. In the Middle Ages, of course, everyone knew these stories. They were used by preachers in sermons, mentioned in scholarly commentaries, reworked by poets in popular verse, or performed in vernacular drama. But the prideful here are forced, as it were, to read with an attentiveness which they had never directed toward these texts before. Here they read them for the first time, as it were. The pain of their own movements, their own painfully keen consciousness of their littleness, of their strength, più non posso, sets the context for appreciating, perhaps for the first time, the insolence of man who tries to rise above the station which has been appointed to him. But as the souls walk around, they do not just undergo suffering which enables them to read the stories they had all known before but never heeded. But through this reading and this purgative experience of pain, they find that their hearts become filled with such a strong desire that it overflows into prayer. And this prayer is given for us at the beginning of Canto 11, and it's one of the most beautiful prayers of all of the comedy. It's 24 verses, that is 8 terzine, but it's worth reading in full. Our Father, who art in heaven, circumscribed only by the greater love you have for your first works on high, praised be your name and power, by every creature as is fitting to render thanks for your sweet breath. May the peace of your kingdom come to us, for we cannot attain it of ourselves, if it come not for all our striving. Give us this day the daily manna, without which he who labors to advance goes backward through this bitter wilderness. And as we forgive those who have wronged us, do you forgive us in your loving kindness. Measure us not as we deserve. Do not put to proof our powers, which yield so lightly to the ancient foe, but deliver us from him who tempts them. This last petition, O our dear Lord, is made not for ourselves, for there is no need, but for the ones whom we have left behind. You notice instantly that what we have is the Lord's Prayer, but it's a variation of it. For Dante's audience, it would have sounded a little funny, because it was in the vernacular, not in Latin. But when you look even closer, you realize that Dante has not bothered to translate the prayer word for word, or phrase for phrase, but makes his souls utter a kind of spontaneous rewriting of the biblical and liturgical prayer, with special glosses built in for their particular benefit. 49 words of Latin become the Italian prayer of more than 160. As if in the vernacular, the Latin prayer releases its potential energy like an uncoiling of a compressed spring. The "You who art in heaven" becomes 3 whole verses, 1 to 3, emphasizing God's transcendence. The "Hallowed be thy name" is amplified into, quote, "Praised be your name and power by every creature, as is fitting to render thanks for your sweet breath." Lines replete with echoes of Francis's hymn of creation. The "Thy kingdom come" becomes, quote, "May the peace of your kingdom come to us, for we cannot attain it of ourselves, if it come not for all our striving," which particularly emphasizes the complete impotence of the prideful to get to the kingdom on their own. And finally, the phrase, "Deliver us from evil," for the prideful, who spent too much time on earth using first-person pronouns, must become a prayer, quote, "Not for ourselves, for us there is no need, but for the ones whom we have left behind." A British scholar and a friend of mine, Matthew Traherne, gave a powerful lecture in which he talks about the role which theology plays in Dante. Referring to a Cambridge theologian by the name of David Ford, Traherne refers to the moods of theology, by which he means not emotional moods, but grammatical moods. If you ever studied Latin, then you remember learning all of those ridiculous endings for verbs. There are endings for the indicative verbs, that is, the mood in which we simply assert and say what it is. The sun is shining brightly. There are endings for verbs of command and ordering, the so-called imperative mood. Go and clean your room, or to borrow an imperative from Cato, run to the mountain. And there are the moods of the subjunctive, that is, verbs used for tentative statements or uncertainty. The subjunctive mood can also be used as a hortatory, that is, as a verb of expression of desire that something be the case, which is not yet. Ford and Traherne continue that most of the time we conduct theology in the indicative mood or the imperative mood. That is, we say God is like this, His law is like this, and thus acted this way. These are not wrong, of course. But what's fascinating and exciting about the comedy is that it progresses increasingly. It lays layers and layers of complexity. So here in Canto 11 of the Purgatorio, we find theology, faced with the mystery of God and His providence, beginning to move into a subjunctive mood, a mood of longing, the expression from the depths of the heart that something be the case, that something take place, or that I begin to move into that reality which I believe in my head and have not gripped with my heart. Dante's language becomes performative. That is, it doesn't just describe a reality, but accomplishes a reality through its utterance, like wedding vows or words of consecration. Let's take all of these features into consideration. The prideful are compelled to conduct a close reading of stories, which they had surely known, but never read with the heart. They also gaze at these images while feeling the conspicuous weight of their burdens. And thus overwhelmed, they cry out with a new prayer which bursts out as a kind of uncontrollable exclamation. And these souls take that prayer which they had learned as good little children and repeated 1,000,000 times without meaning into this new prayer in their own language and written just for them. Taking all these things together, I like to say that for Dante, every truth must be understood to possess both an aesthetic and ethical dimension. That is, if something is true, you wonder at it, marvel at it. But you also understand that now everything must change. As my friend Sean Lewis says, every true statement should be followed by a question mark and an exclamation point. The next few canti, as we have seen, are exceptionally philosophically rich. As Dante and his guide talk about love, freedom, and the relationship between the two, but at the same time, these canti, which deal with the terraces of envy and wrath, are so very human. By which I mean Dante understands the inner life of the heart. He understands those passions and desires which are at once our glory and our undoing. He understands the extraordinary extraordinarily deep work that it takes to rectify the inner desires of the heart. And I think this is on display on the terrace of the envious in Canti 13 and 14. When the pilgrim finally sees the souls of the envious, he is again struck with pity. Or as the poet says, I do not think there walks on earth today a man so hard that he would not have been transfixed by pity at what I saw next. For when I had drawn close enough, so that their state grew clear to me, my eyes were overwhelmed by grief. They appeared covered with coarse haircloth, each propped up another with his shoulder, and all of them were propped against the rock. Just so the blind who lack for daily bread at pardons take their place to beg for what they need, one letting his head fall on another's shoulder. Iron wire pierces all their eyelids, stitching them together, as is done to the untrained falcon because he won't be calmed. Here are the envious, then, with their eyes sewn shut by metal wire. They are thus forced to lean on one another's shoulders. The neighbors whose goods they once envied on earth have now become the only way they don't fall down. Without their neighbors, they have no support. In this way, the envious are made to feel radical weakness and then given one another to help them bear it. In Canto 13, the pilgrim will speak to a woman whom we've already mentioned. She was a Sienese and went by the name of Sapia. According to Dante's imaginative version of her life, Sapia is here now because she was envious of her own well-born relations. So much so that one day, looking out of a tower and seeing her family members destroyed on the battlefield, her heart flared up with joy to see her competition, those who had always got the better portion, those who had been written into the uncle's will, brought low. Envy is an extraordinary passion. In its essence, it is, as medieval theologians put it, the displeasure at another's good. Put that way, it sounds rather stark, but I'm convinced that envy is one of those invisible sins which we don't recognize because it's almost off our contemporary radar. Envy is that secret voice in the heart, which when your friend calls you and tells you about his job promotion, whispers with quiet discontent. Or envy is that voice which murmurs when your old high school classmate shows up and looks far better than you do. Envy is that first untamed response of the heart, which would, if allowed to do so, take the good thing it finds out of existence. In your heart of hearts, if asked of your first impulse, you would rather obliterate a good, a beauty, or a truth, rather than letting it shine in the world as something unpossessed by you. It's somewhat humorous to note, then, that Sapia, even in the afterlife, is still in the process of being cleansed of this vice. At the end of her speech, I've always detected just a bit of envy in how she addresses the pilgrim. She says, "But who are you who walk about inquiring of our condition with your eyes not sown?" And yet, she's on her way. Dante asks the group of souls if any among them is Italian, and Sapia replies, "Oh, my brother, all of us are citizens of the one true city. What you mean to say is who, while still a pilgrim, lived in Italy." You can imagine meeting people who lived thousands of years ago in regions and within boundaries which no longer exist. Those places, those differences, and those boundaries would seem so puny and insignificant after centuries. The souls in hell, though, are fixed and frozen in those outdated things. But here Sapia has begun to view life sub specie eternitatis, that is, in the light of eternity. To look at it in a new light, those things which were so important for an envious person. What precisely belonged to whom and when and how. In Purgatorio, then, vices are healed through developing longing for the virtues which serve as their antidotes. Here on the terrace of the envious, the souls do, of course, have externalized what they had hidden in their hearts. They misused their eyes, using them as a source for sparking discontent. And thus those eyes are sewn shut to prevent them from using them. But at the same time, they're made to listen to the voices of invisible messengers who dash through the air, calling out, Vinum non habent, or I am Orestes, or love him who has done you wrong. The first phrase, they have not wine, is biblical. It's what Mary says to Christ at the wedding of Cana. And thus the souls who hated their neighbor's good are made to contemplate how Mary, moved with love, responded with alacrity to whatever need she found. The phrase, I am Orestes, was allegedly said by Pylades, the best friend of Orestes. According to the Roman version of the Greek myth, the hero Orestes avenged his father, Agamemnon, by killing his adulterous mother. When he was sought for a capital crime, his friend Pylades called out, No, I am Orestes, to protect his friend. We have then another example of that quick-eyed love which rushes to help, the opposite of envy. The third phrase comes from Jesus, but it's another loose vernacular version of the original Latin. Thus, the souls here meditate on a combination of classical and biblical precedents of love and virtue. They fill their minds with concrete examples of the virtues they are just beginning to long for. The phrases which fly through the air help them recall that charity is rapid and rushes to the aid of another. Well, passing up to the next terrace, the pilgrim comes into that area where the wrathful are enveloped in that thick smoke which stings the eyes. In fact, the opening to Canto 16 comes very close to a description of one of the pits of hell. Gloom of hell, or of a night deprived of all stars beneath a barren sky, which everywhere was overcast with clouds, had never put so dark a veil across my eyes, or been so hard and stinging to my sight, as was the smoke that covered us, so that I could not keep my eyelids open. But in the midst of this dark, the souls are singing Agnus Dei. That is, the part of the liturgy which says, Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world, have mercy on us. And they sing, the poet says, with one voice and intonation, so that they seem to share complete accord. Those who are wrathful, who had a tendency to divide the world up into neat little categories of us and them, to identify groups of people as their enemies, are now made to rejoin the human community in harmony. And whereas in life they prayed and longed almost exclusively for justice and vengeance, they are now made to pray for mercy. And finally, they have to remain within the very strict boundaries of this space. That is, dwell within the stinging smoke without leaving it and without opening their eyes. The soul the pilgrim gets to speak with, then, Marco Lombardo, agrees to walk with the pilgrim, but only as far as is permitted. But it might come as a bit of a surprise that in the midst of this canto, Marco Lombardo delivers an angry rant at how evil the world has grown. He says that there are only 3 righteous men left in the world, and even they don't want to be in the world anymore and long for death because they're surrounded by a world of corruption. He says that the Church of Rome has befouled herself and stumbled into the mud, making herself filthy. So what's going on? Does Dante just miss the point about this whole anger thing? You also remember that in a previous canto, Dante delivered a heated invective against Florence. The truth is, for Dante, just as for medieval moral theologians, and this might come as a surprise, anger is not a sin. To be sure, anger can be a sin, but only when it transgresses the appropriate boundaries. In fact, for Dante and for Aquinas, it's possible to sin by not being angry enough. Fundamentally, anger is the desire for revenge. Thus, it's possible to have just anger and to possess the appropriate passion that injustice be corrected. But at the same time, Dante, whom I have called a master of the human heart, knew that it's almost impossible for that anger not to slip and slide into sinful anger. In fact, Aquinas, following an even earlier monastic tradition, says that anger has 6 daughters. That is, it can give birth to various sinful manifestations, such as quarreling. That is, the inability to let a small offense go, or the propensity to start a fight because you're mad about something else. Contempt. That is, a kind of anger which goes beyond an offense at an injustice and leads the angered soul to have contempt for the person he hates. Aquinas also mentions a fascinating and cancerous form of anger, what he calls swelling of the mind, which is a kind of fixation of anger, an inability to think about anything else, a kind of poisoning of the sight in which the eyes become blind to other goods. Thus, you could say that for Dante, as for Aquinas, sinful anger, wrath, is a metastasis of a legitimate desire for justice, for a balancing of the scales. And this helps us understand the contrapposto at play in Canto 15, doesn't it? The souls have to dwell within the smoke and yet remain unharmed by it. That is, keep their vision from being clouded, even while desiring that justice be enacted. They have to hate the evils of the world, but not hate them because they have been harmed personally. What a tall order, to be angry without sinning. It's for this reason, again, that we come to see purgatory as not so much a place of suffering, but as a place of mercy, because it seems almost impossible to be able to do this on your own. This is what I mean by Dante's sensitivity to the human condition. On the one hand, he doesn't deny the essentially affective dimensions of the human experience. He doesn't call us to some fake religiosity in which we've ripped out of our heart all human passions. But at the same time, he knows how easy it is for our passions to become tainted, clouded, or how easy it is for them to be quietly seduced into turning a blind eye to inner uncleanness. It's within this context of human longing and mistaken desiring that Dante leads us to know how difficult it is to get that inner cleanness, or if you like, how important it is for us to practice theology in the subjunctive mood.